Hi everyone, great to be here with you on this snoozer of a political week. Hope you're having a good one. And I'm very excited to introduce our panelists, all chief economists with their organization. Avery Shenfeld is with CIBC Capital Markets. Beata Caranci is with TD Group. Douglas Porter with BMO. Francis Donald with RBC. And Stefane Marion with the National Bank of Canada. Come on up. All right, hi everybody. Nice to see you again 1 year later. I wanted to thank you all for laughing when Stephanie called me brilliant. That was really sweet. Okay, so we have to start off with what both Carol and Stephanie mentioned, which is the threat of these looming tariffs, 25% blanket tariff on all Canadian imports. There have been little to no signs that the President of the United States is not going to apply these. There are some ministers who say in recent days they think they can still avoid them. The premiers are talking in a different way. We also, as you guys are all aware, have a very unique situation politically, domestically right now. I wanted to start off from an economic perspective on a very positive note. Avery, ask you, if these tariffs are applied, how would you quantify the economic impact on this country's economy?
We actually had a session for our own teams with former Bank of Canada Governor Stefane Marion, and actually like what he said about this. He said that anybody who tells you they can quantify the impact of a two-way trade war on the Canadian economy is lying. And to some extent, he's right, in the sense that we can't look back at the last time a 25% tariff was suddenly imposed on the entire country's exports. There was no last time. When you get down to it, each industry will respond very differently. In some cases, we can pass on the tariff. In some cases, in passing it on to the buyer, which is the US, there's a big drop in demand. In other cases, the demand is inelastic and we don't see that. There are cases where the US can quickly substitute for what we produce, and so we would lose a lot of market share in a hurry. But what we do know is, without being able to put a decimal place on this, that the impact is large, in the sense that we can look back at what happened when they put a tariff on steel and aluminum. I think that might have been a 25% tariff. The drop in our steel exports during the 1 year where that took place subtracted about a half a point from Canadian GDP. That's one product area. So multiply that across the economy, it's bad. Of course, there are things we can do to respond. We can cut interest rates more, we can provide more stimulus to domestic demand, so we can help the economy recover. We can have the Canadian dollar dip even more to shelter some of those exports. But it's definitely a serious issue, and it warrants all the attention being given. And just by way of comparison, when they were talking about ripping up NAFTA in the first term, we would go to most favored nations tariffs without NAFTA. They average about 3%. So, and we were worried about that. We were worried more about things like dispute resolution and so on, but we're talking 20%, 25% tariffs, that's enormous.
Beata, premiers collectively and unanimously all say that their provincial economies would immediately enter into a recession. Not in the technical sense, but it would right away start an economic contraction. Are they right?
Yeah, I don't think anybody here would forecast a strong growth year for Canada. Or that's a big strategic call if that's the case. So I think that would be about right because of the high trade reliance. And I think what everybody's trying to understand, you can see what's happening on the political front. The premiers are now trying to front run for the vacuum that is now created at the federal level. And Trump led us to believe that this was really about border control, but hey, why not just take over the whole country and that solves all your problems, except they don't manage their own borders, both of them very well. So, the bigger item here that needs to be negotiated is what do we have that they need, and that is always going to come back to our land. And that's why that Canada looks so interesting, as well as Greenland, and why we're lumped into those two regions. And even though much of the trade irritants are with China and Mexico, they have been largely absent from the trolling that we're getting out of the US, and it's really fallen onto to countries who have massive land mass. Like in Canada, there's only 4 people per square kilometer, so there's more of us here than would fill up a square kilometer. And in Greenland, it's the least densely populated country in the world. So they want the land, they want the minerals, and they want to get us going on it. And so in some respect, as negative as this is from an economic prospect, if we just take a step back, and what might come out of this is we've always needed a push in Canada to get going on things that are environmentally sensitive. And this is one avenue that will have to get us thinking more forward-looking about what we can actually put forward. And it's not the promise of critical minerals, because we've had that promise in Canada for decades. It's the delivery of it, and it's the action of it. And that's really our only negotiation tool.
So I actually wanted to delve into that a little bit, Deb, and the prospect of what Canada's response looks like should these be applied. There's a very live conversation going on behind the scenes, not just about tariffs on Florida orange juice, but on cutting off the supply of things like critical minerals or oil, or adding a large export tax to them. There's obviously a lot of pushback from premiers of provinces where much of those natural resources sit, in the case of oil in Alberta and Saskatchewan, or even electricity in Ontario, something Doug Ford has publicly said. What would the impact of that be here?
Well, it would also be negative here in Canada. I mean, almost any reasonable response we would have to 25% tariffs would rebound on us and be painful as well. It's interesting, I had the pleasure of being on a conference call with Canada's main negotiator for the USMCA, Steve Verheuvel, and actually one of his responses was that in a true trade war, one of the things we would look at is putting export taxes on food and energy. Unfortunately, the political reality of that, it's just not going to fly. Alberta, of course, is not going to go along with that. But, you know, perhaps Alberta could go on a month-long maintenance of their entire oil facilities, you know, at a convenient time, and, you know, unable to produce any oil for exports for a month. But this is very serious business. I mean, just getting it back, and, you know, as much as Avery said, we can't put a number on it. The kind of numbers we are looking at are declines on the order of about 3% of GDP. And when you think, you know, in the best case scenario, we'd be looking at about 2% growth over the next year. This is quite serious business indeed.
What does that translate to when you talk, Francis, about the labor market? Because I think for regular people, when we hear all the back and forth about tariffs, when we hear premiers talk about the possible shedding of millions of jobs, that is, you know, very, very scary thing. What is your assessment of what this might do to the labor market?
Well, it depends on the magnitude as well. So my colleagues here have talked about how difficult that is to quantify. We have to run a variety of scenarios. What if it's just a few select goods? Then it's a few decimal points across a range of indicators. Or if it's as threatened, we have very similar outlook to Doug, that this could be multiple years of really sizable pull downs and pronounced recessionary periods. So the labor market follow on to that, nobody in here needs a PhD in economics to know that that's challenging for a labor market that is already in a position of struggling, because the unemployment rate in Canada is rising. We have it going to 7% over the course of the next year. Job vacancies are becoming larger. This is not you know, a 2018 type of economy. These problems, these threats, these vulnerabilities are hitting Canada at a time when the labor market is softening. The central bank is already having to cut rates pretty aggressively, and potential growth in Canada is collapsing with low productivity. So I think about these shocks a lot like immune systems. So in Canada, if you think about your economic immune system as being your ability to weather a cold. So I have kids in daycare and they come home with colds all the time. I have a really good, strong immune system. The US economy is in a position of very strong immune system. It has high productivity, AI is going really well, they're not very interest rate sensitive, they've had huge fiscal pushes. Their ability to weather this storm is much bigger than our immune system. Unlike the American immune system, which is like those guys in Venice Beach who are, you know, pumping muscle, we're a little bit more like those kids that eat a lot of junk food and probably watch too much TV. So what worries me is that the shock that's coming through in Canada is occurring in an environment of weakness to start with, and that compounds some of the challenges of the shocks. And that's true for the labor market, but it's also true for a range of other elements. But I just want to emphasize here that we have threats in the prior, or in Trump 45. We had big threats that sound like these ones that didn't actually materialize. So as much as we spend a significant amount of time talking about those threats and the vulnerabilities and the viruses, the daycare shocks that are going to come through, I also think we need to remember that we can simultaneously be building up our economic immune system and not to lose sight of some of these elements that would help us more resilient, because this isn't the last geopolitical shock Canada is going to face. We are in a new era. There will be more daycare colds coming ahead. So keeping that parallel track is going to be very important for Canada in the next few years.
I have a lot of questions about building up that resiliency in just a few moments, but Stefane, I wanted to get you on this issue as well, because a couple of the conversations I had over the weekend with people involved in speaking to Trump's team, they told me that it had been conveyed to them that it would be possible that upon the announcement of these tariffs, let's say through executive order, that they would be applied 6 months beyond that. So let's say there is, and that's not a guarantee, obviously, like this is just stuff coming from people around Trump. But let's say there is that interim period before the tariffs are applied. Is there a possible economic impact to even the specter of them?
We're going to see the economic impact over the next few months. There will be no business investment in Canada. That's a given. So we're going to have weak growth. Now, in terms of our posture and what we do, I've seen a bunch of politicians arguing this week that it's not their fault. It's everybody's fault but their fault. But as Francis said, our economy is a stinker to start off with, and that's a made in Canada strategy. We've never seen such a divergence in economic performance between Canada and the US. If you look at the output gap, we've never seen the US operating so much above its speed limit and Canada so much below its speed limit. Again, that's a made in Canada strategy. So we have a stinker of an economy. We are concerned about American tariffs. 25%, that seems to be a big number, right, Vassy? But you know what the tariff equivalent is on interprovincial trade barriers, Canada? 21%. So why don't we act? Why don't we get our act together and fix that? And that would be a formidable offset to the US, right? So what I'm saying here is this is an opportunity to fix our economy. And I think we have the means to do so. So yes, let's stop blaming the rest of the world. Yes, we have challenges, but we have our own challenges, and it's a key opportunity. It's one in a lifetime opportunity to fix our economy once and for good.
Don't know if you missed it. There's a task force that's being established to tackle interprovincial trade for the 700th time. I'm just kidding. One more question about that. I'm not kidding. Actually, it has been reestablished, but. One more question about, not the tariff specifically, but basically Donald Trump, Avery, coming into office, in the economic policy that he has signaled he will pursue in the US, namely around tax cuts, around abandoning the Inflation Reduction Act, and, quote unquote, drill baby drill. I'm wondering in the aggregate, what the pursuit of policies like that south of the border might mean for our economy here.
So I think you have to take any election campaign with a bit of a grain of salt, first of all. Not everything that's said in a campaign is going to happen. I don't think waiters are going to get tax-free tips, for example. And Congress plays a big role here. So let's not forget that just in the last few weeks, Congress decided and rejected Trump's request to put aside the debt ceiling for 2 years. And so that was a message from Republicans, particularly his own party, that no, they still want to take debt ceiling seriously. They're not willing to just have tax cuts and let the deficit blow up. So we do have to think a little bit about what Congress is going to approve. Drill baby drill, that's a nice slogan. US oil production's at a record high already. And no doubt they will expand some drilling activity and they will lighten up the regulatory burden. I think it's fair to say that given, I didn't put my red tie on today and I put a blue one on, it's not because I'm joining RBC. Maybe I'm trying to play with the current political environment in Canada, but we do know that in odds are, the polls are right. We will also have a government coming to Canada that already is leaning towards certainly a lighter regulatory hand on our own energy sector, so there's a spillover there. And I'd say again, on things like, for example, renewable power, Trump rails against windmills, but at the same time, there are a lot of Republican states that are getting a lot of that IRA money. that have a lot of projects underway. There's a big demand for electric power in the United States. Some of that is going to come from renewable energy. So it's not clear that all these things are going to happen. But one thing I would say is that the trade war in itself, that's not a winner for the US economy. Remember that the US is pretty close to full employment. And essentially, if you put big two-way trade barriers on, the US ends up having to do less of things that it's good at, where it exports those things, and more of things that it's not as good at, which is why it's importing them. So overall, the US has had tremendous productivity growth. Putting a big barrier on two-way trade, if it involves not just Canada, but Europe, Mexico, and so on, is going to end up reallocating American labor in a way that is less productive. So again, that's why I think some of us, any card-carrying economist is typically not a fan of big trade barriers. And that gives us, if we do have that 6-month window in which to try to fend this off, it will be trying to reach out to people in the administration, in Congress, in state governments to try to make that case that this is not a winner for the US either. And by the way, we may offer to rename the Canada Goose the America Goose, because I think that Trump shows some interest in that, given that it's going to be the Gulf of Mexico, or actually someone told me it's the Gulf of Mexico, to play into Trump's part. So there's certainly an interest in, if we have 6 months to make a deal, that would be certainly much more encouraging than tariffs go on right away.
My understanding though, Beata, is that when the case was made by ministers at Mar-a-Lago that a trade war hurts everyone, the response from the new Commerce Secretary was, it'll hurt you guys a lot more.
Yeah, I think, so what Trump says in terms of, hey, we're going to put tariffs on you because we want you to make sure that you allocate your resources and time to border security, whether it's people flow or drug flow or whatever the case. Part of that, when it comes to Canada, is smokes and mirrors, right? Their bigger objective is to reduce reliance on China. China has them on a bended knee when it comes to the dependence that they have on the rare earths, critical minerals, and pharma products. And they know it. They haven't attacked China to the same degree that they've attacked other countries who are technically allies. So the objective of what they're trying to do, we can sit there and put all our resources, and Ontario announced OBP officers on the border, and Alberta announced it, and put an 18-month plan on, but we're still hearing it. We're still hearing tariffs. It's not going to be enough, because what we ultimately have to do is think through the structure of our economy, look at our competitive advantage, what we have that they don't, and move our economy in that way. And I think that's what Stefane is ultimately getting at. Trade has been built on a comparative advantage. Hey, you can make this part better than me, and I can make that part better than you, and you can do this a little cheaper, and I can do that a little cheaper, but there's nothing stopping the US from building a car from beginning to end. They can do it. It requires a restructuring of their labor market. It would lead to higher end user costs, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that ultimately if you give it enough time. They can't come up with rare earths and critical minerals, pharma products, and other factors like they can get out of Canada or Greenland and others. Now keep in mind, Canada only has about 1% to 2% of these in global reserves, identified reserves, but we produce 0 on rare earths. And we don't need to produce enough to supply the whole world, we just need to produce enough to provide it to one country. And so that's where we need to get our mindset. Like, we have to do elements to appease the president, but at the same time, don't lose this opportunity to pivot your economy towards your competitive advantage, as opposed to just try to keep up the comparative side of the economy, because that's going to be a losing strategy in the long term, because there's nothing to stop the next president, the next one from continuing with these tactics. You have to have something they need. Energy is a really good one. The only reason we have a trade surplus with the US is because of oil and gas. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline has inflated that even more, because it's getting shipped to the coast, getting shipped down the coast to the west, and then they are re-exporting it. And so we know that they have a high dependence on energy. So it goes back to like, what's our structure, what's our competitive advantage, and it goes back to things that we have been denying in our structure for years, which is our resources and lands and the regulations and how much we've hampered ourselves. Like, I understand my structure of my body, right? I was a week in Dominican Republic. I do not sit in the sun. I come out 2 colors, white or red. I'm a Canadian flag. That's it, right? I'm the only person who goes out at 7 in the morning to get that one chair under the one palm tree on the beach. That's me, right? And I think in Canada we have to understand we have huge advantages that they want, and that's why we're getting the attacks. We need to think through big ideas of whoever's the future political leader, not just on removing the interprovincial trade barriers, but where do we move so that we actually have something that the rest of the world cannot make, cannot produce, and we've got it. And it's all under our grounds.
Well, that leads us perfectly into domestic policy and maybe a little politics. There was just a bit of that this week. And a quick reminder, if you have questions for our economists, the number to text is up there. And for the last 20 minutes or so, I'll pose your questions to them. Doug, on Monday, Justin Trudeau quit as leader of the Liberal Party, you may have noticed. He'll stick on as PM until his replacement is chosen, which I think will happen around the beginning of March. Though the rules and formalities of that have yet to be set, but probably will any minute now. What is Justin Trudeau's economic legacy? It's an easy one.
So just so everyone knows, we did not know the questions ahead of time. And oh, look at the time. We're almost
46 minutes.
So let's face it, the entire world went through a brutal pandemic, which led to inflation globally. So I don't think we can really pin that, or the big run-up in interest rates. I think that when we look back over the last 10 years, we have had a dreadful productivity performance, as Stefane alluded to. Some of that is the denominator, just the fact that we had some of the fastest population growth that we have seen in our history in the last 10 years, and exploded in the last 3 years. We had 3 million people in the last 3 years, and I do think that that did play some role in the weakness that we've seen in productivity, and the flip side of that has been the absolutely horrendous housing affordability issue we've been left with. And I think some of that is his legacy. But you will also recall in 2015, with great fanfare, he talked about running a $10 billion deficit to kickstart the economy, and then it would be balanced within 4 years. I'm not going to blame the run-up in the deficit during the pandemic on the Liberals. That happened, as I said, around the world. But there's clearly been some weakening of our fiscal anchors in the last 10 years. It's interesting when we look back at the bigger picture, though. The debt to GDP went from about 30% of GDP before to just a wee bit more than 40% now, which is not a horrendous, it's unfortunate, but it's not a horrendous deterioration that we've seen on the fiscal side. But this year's budget deficit has been revised up by 10 billion. When we think back about that initial effort to kickstart the economy, it's obviously we've lost our fiscal rectitude and discipline over the past 10 years, and that may well be one of the biggest changes or legacies of the past 10 years. But I actually would say the single thing that really stands out to me is the very aggressive immigration policy we've had in the past 10 years, and what that's done for both positive and negative.
I have more questions about immigration, because if any of you were here last year, I feel like all of you collectively kind of prompted the discussion that ended up taking place, and ultimately massive, policy changes that took about 10 months to actually fully be announced. But what a different world we are in from a policy perspective in that area now than we were exactly a year ago. Francis, Justin Trudeau's replacement asks you for a meeting and says, how do we, what's the 1 or 2 main things I have to do in order to build this country's immune system? What do you say?
It's not 1 or 2 things. Of course, the economists are asked a lot of political questions. We're not sitting in Ottawa and have all the answers to these, and we're also asked to fix things. So I think we're probably better at diagnosing the issues than we are in necessarily always giving a very precise treatment. But several of the problems that we see in Canada are decades in the making. The productivity decline has been happening for 40 years as it comes down. And so the simple answer to that question is, well, you gotta increase productivity, but then there's the big how attached to it. And what's fascinating to me is that we know productivity is weak. We know that we're just not as good as we used to be at creating things and building things and generating output. But if you look across this country, when I speak to my clients, the reasons for that tend to be very different sector by sector, region by region, province by province. And so when I'm asked this question, I often feel the same way as when I look at my house and I realize that every room is messy and where the heck are you gonna start? And the advice you get is start in one corner. Clean one corner at a time and build your way out. So there's a lot of little corners that we can work on. I think interprovincial trade barriers, as Stefane mentioned, is a hugely important one. I think we need to think about the role of energy that exists. I think we can do a lot on red tape, regulatory, how long it takes to get, for example, just the construction permits. We need to be building housing supply. This is the single biggest thing, in my view, that needs to happen urgently and immediately. But at this point, I don't even care which one we start with. Let's get into one corner of the house and start cleaning. I think importantly, and we're talking a lot about what tariffs do in 2025 and 2026, but the economic conversations now are longer term because we aren't going to fix. I didn't use the same terms that Stefane used, but the challenges that exist, the stinker of an economy, doesn't get fixed in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. This is probably a lengthy adjustment that will take us a while to get through. And I think that's important for us as Canadians to understand. It's very common for me to give a presentation about Canada and then for someone to say to me, but what's the good news? And I want to give that because there's so many beautiful things about this country that I love, that we all love. We know we're incredibly well educated, high human capital, we have resources, we have access to the Arctic, we have all the tinder it takes to make a fire. This all exists, but we also have to take a moment if we're operating businesses and we're operating as Canadians to have an honest conversation about the state of play as to where we're in now and have a very adult conversation about how long it's going to take us to remedy multiples of these problems. There is no quick fix, is effectively what I'm saying, but of course we could give you a long list of things to start with. Those are a few that I would look at.
In layman's terms, why, in your view, is the economy a stinker? And do you agree with the assessment that there's no quick fix?
You've been asking a lot of questions this morning. Let me ask you one. Are we a trading nation, in your opinion?
Yes.
What do we trade?
What do we export?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. Car parts, oil.
We're trading energy, that's it. Our non-energy surplus is non-existent. It's a deficit of 5%. Why is that? We have the smallest manufacturing sector in the G7. Our strategy over the past 20 years has been, let's decarbonize by sending our pollution to the rest of the world. We've just outsourced production to the rest of the world because manufacturing output is higher in the rest of the world. Now I ask you again, if you sign a free trade agreement, and all my colleagues say we have to use a comparative advantage, surely Vassy would say, well, if I sign a free trade agreement to grow my manufacturing sector according to my comparative advantage, it's not to have the atrophy that we're seeing in manufacturing right now, where manufacturing on a per capita basis is down 30% for the past 20 years, while the US is out 10%. Figure that out. So what do we trade? So, not that I like him, but when the US President-elect Beata says, well, what do we need from Canada? What do they have that I need? Given the size of the manufacturing sector, we've made ourselves irrelevant in the North American supply chain. So we do have the capability to rebuild that. But that's a key corner, like Francis was alluding to corners. So why don't we make ourselves the best retaliation against America? We will be the most interesting place to invest. We have energy. If you're going to do manufacturing, well, you need natural gas. 34% of the energy consuming manufacturing is natural gas. The other one is electricity, 30%. We have the cheapest natural gas in the world and the cheapest electricity in the world. Well, we use this as this opportunity to rebuild the manufacturing sector. But yes, I agree, it will mean more pollution, but it's better that this pollution be here with more decent energy than sending it and having manufacturing built on coal, as it is in Asia right now. So that's how we bring back our comparative advantage. We have the resources. You're going to do manufacturing, you do resources. That wipes out our comparative advantage by having countries that have no comparative advantage using that posture. So, no, we can't have capital gains inclusion that goes up in April. You can't do that. That was a budget that was designed in April before we knew the outcome of the US election. We have to adapt to that situation. We have to be the most interesting place to invest in North America, and we can do that. And that's important.
And I think actually I just want to add, when we talk about how, we're in this very challenging environment and there's a long list of things that need to get done, it's not from an area of hopelessness. It's not saying, oh my gosh, there's so much work to do, we should be so overwhelmed. It's that there are so many things that can be done that can help incrementally move. There's no one quick fix, but there's an extremely long list that this panel, when I was an audience member, have talked about for years as being incrementally helpful. This is going to be a block by block rebuild, with some blocks being quite a little bit bigger, such as the ones that Stefane is mentioning.
I want to quickly ask Avery about what you referenced a few minutes ago with your blue tie, that there is likely, according to public opinion polling, going to be a change in government, and that the Conservatives will be in power. Have you heard anything from them that you can discern would amount to economic policy? Like, are there, you talked about, less regulation. We've heard about spending cuts, for example, though no specifics at this juncture, just that they're studying what they can cut. What sort of picture can you paint for people who are here today of what we might be in for if the Conservatives win, from an economic perspective?
So I think I remember the slogan, was it cut the crime, axe the tax, a few things out of the rhyme, bring it home. So what is there behind that? And there are some details. So clearly there is, if you listen carefully, and I listened to, I think it was an hour and a half interview that he did online, not with CTV, but he should have. But what he did talk about was, he did talk about being conservative in the traditional sense of believing in smaller government. So it's clear there's an emphasis on going beyond just closing the English language CPC, but paring back some of the size of government. Not specifically, right? There's no specifics there. I don't think that involves a fiscal contraction or a big drag on the economy, because at the same point, he's also talking about relieving Canadians of some of the tax burden. So even on the deficit, I know some of my colleagues are saying, oh, Trudeau's lost control of the deficit and so on. Let's not forget that this year's deficit, the government's estimate is 1.6% of GDP. The US federal deficit is running at over 6% of GDP. So actually, by the standards of Europe, the US, we're doing quite well on that. And even if the a new government promises to balance the budget, typically they'll make a promise like that over our 5-year term, we'll balance the budget. Well, that's only subtracting a few decimal places from GDP each year. So I don't think it's an austerity government, because they pare back spending. They also will relieve us on some taxes. The other clear focus has been on the energy sector, not just the carbon tax, but the regulatory burden on new projects and so on. So it's clear there's a lightening there. On housing, it's fair to say the Liberals are throwing a lot of money on trying to get support municipalities with infrastructure and so on that's necessary to build housing. The Conservatives have a different approach as to who's going to get money. So both governments planning on doing that. I think the Conservatives will carry through it. Reducing population growth for a couple of years. So some of it is similar. But by and large, the biggest sectors that you can point to and say things are going to change a bit, I think, is energy resources, lightening the regulatory burden. And, it's typical for a Canadian opposition party when you're winning, don't provide too many details. So we'll get the details after an election in probably early May. But I think generally speaking, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And I would agree with what Francis said, there's no quick fix, right? It's not as if, and Canada, by the way, is not the only country that's looking at US productivity numbers and saying, what's wrong with us? All of Europe is saying that too. So this productivity miracle has been AI, big developments in corporate sector US that other countries have not been able to keep pace with. We're in the same boat. And hopefully, I agree with Francis, I think that if we start one little bit at a time, we can fix some of that. But it's all going to be a lot more difficult if we're behind a big tariff wall.
Actually, can I ask a question,
Yes.
Avery? Name me one big energy producer in the world that has a productivity problem. Europeans are not energy producers. Name me one.
So, we don't have a productivity problem. We just haven't been growing the sector. We have basically put and that was Canadians, let's not forget, okay, those of us in the room here, this was Canadians' political choice. If you go back and you look at the last few elections and you say, why did the Liberals win those elections, or at least win a minority government? One big reason was that voters decided that what Scherer and other conservative leaders were offering in terms of containing Canada's carbon emissions wasn't enough. Certainly Ontario and Quebec voters, not Alberta voters, I'm sure, but we're still voting largely on that. And so it does take a change in political sentiment to shift that. And one unfortunate thing that's happening for the climate is we can see that the US is going to make much less effort in that direction. And it may well be that Canadian voters decide, you know what, if the Americans aren't pulling their weight, that maybe we won't pull as much of that burden either. So it's up to Canadian voters to decide the balance between, do we want more oil sands plants, or do we want to cap future activity in order to meet some defined carbon emissions goal? That was what voters...
I have to come to the defense of Canadians in this room. Yes, I think Canadians have high consciousness on environmental policy. When you come out and say we're going to have a carbon tax, that's different than when you say, oh, now we're going to have an emissions cap. Now we're going to contain methane. Now we're going to make a decision on whether a project can be greenlit or not, which Alberta challenged and subsequently got changed. That is a layering of regulation that is completely unnecessary. Pick a lane and stick with it, and it creates business uncertainty. If you look at Norway, also an energy producing country, this year in the papers they reported that almost 100% of their vehicle sales were EV, so in 2024. Clearly a milestone that we won't be at probably for over a decade. They also have a carbon tax, and they're within the EU, so they also work within the trading system, but it's one or the other. And they are more mindful of that impact as it filters through the downstream. And I think where we lost our way is we just thought more was better. We did it with immigration, and we did it here on climate policy. And I think there's an aspect where you can roll back regulation without losing sight that you're still environmentalists and you're still doing aspects that are beneficial for the economy in the long term, for the citizens in the long term, and for the land. But you have to do it in a smart way. And I think what we've seen in the last decade is we've just seen too much layering. It's the same problem we see in other sectors of Canada with regulation. We have too many conflicting policies. It frustrates businesses. You can see it in our entry rates of businesses. We have falling dynamism, which is a greater rate of exits of businesses than entry. It's happening particularly in the manufacturing sector with companies that are between 100 and 499 employees. That's really important. That's your missing middle. They don't get to be big, right? And they don't get to be that powerhouse on the economic scale, even for employment. And so we really have to start thinking like, what if we have gone full hog in so many areas that we need to dial those back, and we talk about cleaning corners of the house. That has to be a priority, but that has to go across every industry, so you can't just do it in one industry. We have to have a mindset of really tackling this across the country in every industry.
Stefane, I think you want to jump in. I just quickly would say that I do think, though, to Avery's point, that the Liberals did signal to voters that they would place a primacy on reducing emissions. I agree that they didn't necessarily say we're going to do X, Y, Z, et cetera, but I do think that there was a message that we have a plan, a more robust plan, and the alternative does not. And that at the time, in 2021 and 2019, it resonated enough. I don't think that issue, if you look at all public opinion polling right now, resonates in the same way that it did 4 years ago. And to that effect, I interviewed the energy minister last night, who's considering running, the man who has defended the emissions cap for the last number of years, who's considering running for the leadership, who now says he would consider another tool.
Okay,
So
so
I agree with you.
Yes,
I agree.
I'm just going to
There's
give
been a
Stefane
voter change.
Yes, Stefane, go ahead.
First of all, Avery, you didn't answer my question, so we're ready for politics. You didn't give me one country. Now, Beata, the good people of Norway, beautiful people of Norway, they just announced yesterday that they exported a record amount of natural gas last year, and they're going to drill this year another 40 wells in the Northern Sea. And they will flare the world with methane emissions, which we don't do in Canada, and methane is 80 times worse than CO2 emissions. So that's the good people in Norway's way. And they sell their gas at world price, well, we said at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, which is the cheapest thing in the world. So who puts a carbon tax under these circumstances? What are we willing to achieve? What are we going to achieve? We're not selling the natural gas to the rest of the world like Norway's doing. So I totally disagree with that model because they'll give you $20,000 a year to buy electrical vehicles, so no wonder that they're fully electric. But they announced 4 weeks ago that they're considering curtailing their exports to Europe because they have issues in producing electricity. So that's so much for the Swedish model, the Norwegian model, which is always quoted as a model of productivity. They leverage their resource sector to make themselves look better, and we don't do that. Now, to your question, to your electoral platform, I agree with Avery. It was a choice made by Canadians in 2015 when the world was a different place. At this point in time, we don't have the same friends that we did in 2015. So where I critique the current government is they've never been able to adapt to a changing geopolitical environment. So that pledge in 2015 doesn't hold in 2015.